On September 3rd, 1929, the American stock market hit the highest point it had ever reached. Everyone assumed it would keep climbing. 56 days later, it fell off a cliff. 16 million shares dumped in a single Tuesday, fortunes wiped out between lunch and the closing bell. By the time the bleeding had finally stopped, 3 years later, the market had lost almost 90% of its value. 9,000 banks had failed, and 1 in 4 Americans were out of work. That's the story of 1929 by Andrew Ross Sorkin, the journalist behind the book Too Big to Fail. So this is inside the greatest crash in Wall Street history and how it shattered a nation. To understand why 1929 hits as hard as it does, you have to understand the world that you walk into. By the late 1920s, the stock market stopped being something for bankers and becoming something for everyone. Cab drivers, school teachers, shoe shine boys, ordinary people were pouring their savings into stocks, convinced the only direction was up. And most of them weren't even using their own money. They were buying on margin. You could put down as little as 10% and borrow the other 90% from your broker. When prices rose, you made a fortune on money you never had. It was rocket fuel, and it worked, right up until it didn't. On September 3rd, 1929, as previously mentioned, the Dow Jones hit an all-time high of 381. It had more than quadrupled in under a decade. To almost everyone watching, it looked unstoppable. Then came the last week of October, Thursday the 24th, later called Black Thursday. Nearly 13 million shares changed hands as panic set in. The following Monday, the market fell almost 13% in a single day. And on Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday, over 16 million shares were dumped and the floor gave way completely. The next morning, the trade paper Variety ran the headline that said it all. Wall Street lays an egg. But the crash was only the beginning. All that borrowed money had to be paid back, so the losses tore straight through the banking system. Over the next 4 years, roughly 9,000 banks, more than a third of every bank in America, failed. And when a bank went under, the savings inside it simply vanished. The damage spread from Wall Street to Main Street with terrifying speed. Unemployment, near 3% in 1929, climbed to almost 25% by 1933. 1 in 4 working Americans had no job. Industrial production was cut nearly in half. And the market itself kept falling for more than 3 years. By the summer of 1932, the Dow had lost roughly 90% of its value. It would not return to its peak 1929 until 1954, a full quarter century later. Out of that wreckage came the rules we still live under. The Securities and Exchange Commission, Federal Deposit Insurance, the guardrails built so it could never happen again. That's the world the book 1929 lives in. So I read this book because I like understanding history, especially when it comes to the economy. I recently did a book on here called 1873. I've read many books on the 2008 crash. I do plan to read Too Big to Fail next after reading this because it's kind of a sequential 1873, 1929, and then 2008. These are those like the big 3 crashes. And what you find with these books, like almost everything, is that history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes. It's usually the same concepts happening in different ways, and that's what you get in this book. So it essentially it's kind of a narrative format in the sense that it's walking you through the main players of the 1929 crash. It's talking to you about the bankers, the government, people involved, particularly with a focus on Herbert Hoover, who was president at the time, but then Roosevelt, who was taking over. There's a focus on those two. A big focus on heads of banks like J.P. Morgan, Jack Morgan, the initial owner of, at the time it was called, I think, Morgan Bank, something like that. They later, merged with Chase. Thomas Lamont, Andrew Wiggins. So it goes through a lot of the players. That is one part that I always struggle with a bit in history books is they introduce so many people because you don't have a lot of content in terms of what people were talking about like you do with modern day books because there's just so much more out there to write about. With history books, you have to introduce a lot of characters to fill the pages. And I do find that hard to struggle with. It's not a particular issue with this book, it's just kind of me with history, but that's what happens in this book. And then it walks through the whole crash in detail. And it walks you through how it happened, who the players were, what the result was, and then kind of what I would call the witch hunt afterwards, which is who do we blame and how do we throw them in jail? And I use that term loosely with quotations because nothing ever actually really happens. If you remember 2008, barely anything ever happened. It's like we try to put someone out there in the media and prop a few people up as if they were so much different than everyone else. But anyways, this crash was similar. You had people buying on euphoria. They were buying stocks on margin. This is the sort of the first time that ordinary people were buying stocks, and it was all euphoric. And you had bankers that were allowing this to happen, all of this speculation. You had banks that did not separate between investing and individual deposits, and then all this stuff fails. So it's good to understand these books. This is a really well-researched book. From my understanding, this is the first time anyone had access to this information. I think a lot of it came from he went into the libraries at like Harvard and like the literally like fed minutes from almost a century ago. And so it was good information, well written. I want to read a few quotes that the book says here at the end, because I think that they're important to sort of understanding this book. The first one is, could the 1929 crash have been avoided? The short answer is yes. There were plenty of opportunities to arrest the forces of speculation before they got out of hand. The long answer is that it would have taken almost divine prescience to look beyond the short-term incentives for making money and focus instead on the long-term consequences. Man, that last sentence there to me kind of sums up mankind, particularly men, unfortunately. When it comes to short-term incentives on a cultural level, like at a people level, not necessarily individual level, but at a group of people level, you want to kick the can down the road. We see this all the time in government where we're not going to be worried about what's going on with the climate. We're not going to be worried about what's going on with the national debt. We've got this thing going on right now, and we need things to work right now. Like there's the ability to forego short-term wins is not a real thing in reality when it comes to groups of humans. Individuals do it. It's a very important thing, but groups of people are so bad at that. And that's the thing that kind of, I think, is one of the biggest problems with our societies. One other one that I had highlighted here was, markets are not contests of virtue and honor. By pitting the greed of their participants against one another, they wend their messy way toward fair and reasonable prices. Over time, in the aggregate, system works, even if at any given moment it can look like pure chaos. Another reminder that the stock market is just like, it brings out the worst in people. You're not contributing to society when you take money and make more money out of money. You're not giving goods to society. It's such an odd concept and an odd thing, and it literally is similar to gambling in the sense of it just brings out the worst sides of people. I mean, that's the reality of it. And so we tend to think of people they're like such devilish humans to be doing these gambling. And a lot of times it's good people that have good intentions that are just behaving on their worst human instincts. And that's what the stock market literally brings out in people. And I try to remind myself of that today. And then the last one here, I'll end with this. The enduring lesson is not that booms can be prevented or that busts can be fully averted. It is that we need to remember how easily we forget. The antidote to irrational exuberance is not regulation by itself, nor skepticism, but humility. The humility to know that no system is foolproof, no market fully rational, and no generation exempt. The greater the heights of our certainty, the longer and harder we fall. Again, we see this play out over and over and over again. For me, in 2026, what I think of for this is the national debt. It's unbelievable how bad of a problem that is, and we're just not going to address it because it's not a problem today. We just think AI is going to solve that problem, and man, generations behind me are going to suffer because of that. So that's the book, 1929, by Andrew Ross Sorkin, same guy that wrote Too Big to Fail. I think he's the head of Squawk Box on CNN, if I'm correct. So I enjoyed it. Good read. You've got to be into history. It's certainly not like a fun, enjoyable read in the sense of like fast-paced, but it's a good book, well-researched, well-written. Thanks for watching.